Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now years ago, if you wanted the best AMD processor inside your system, then you probably would have opted for something like an FX 8350, 8370, or if you liked a massive electric bill and tons of heat, then maybe even the FX 9590. This of course was AMD's top of the range 8-core chip, although I feel like the most popular option was probably the FX 8350, a chip that I've got here today. Now, these chips are quite hard to recommend in 2020 because not only do we have the Ryzen range, especially the Ryzen 3 entry-level chips, but when it comes to finding these on the used market, they are still quite expensive. You can't really find, at least here in the UK, an FX 8300 series chip for less than the price of, say, a Ryzen 3 1200. In fact, the cheapest I've seen them on eBay is probably about £70 or £80, and that's if you're lucky. A couple of years ago I saw a video from OzTalks Hardware here on YouTube. He compared a Ryzen 3 1200 to an FX 8370, I believe. I'll leave a link to it down below in the description. It's definitely worth checking out, as well as the rest of his videos actually. But today I wanted to compare the FX 8350, what was, I'd argue, possibly one of the most popular AMD FX chips, to the newly released entry-level Ryzen 3 3100, a £99 chip that is probably the one to go for if you are on a tight budget. Now I know what you're thinking, just like in the previous i3 530 and i3 10100 comparison, the new Ryzen 3100 is going to blow the old FX out of the water, but I thought it would be interesting to see nonetheless, because I don't know what to expect in terms of how big the difference between the two is. So without further ado, I guess we should get into the results. Now just like before, I'll be throwing up the FX 8350 gameplay on screen and then putting up the comparative results afterwards. So with the FX 8350, we're using DDR3 RAM, 16 gigs of 1600 megahertz, and with the Ryzen 3 we're using 16 gigs of DDR4 clocked at 3200 megahertz. So immediately we have that RAM advantage. Like I said before though, that's just how it is. If you're buying a new AM4 chip, then you are going to be using DDR4 RAM, and there's no point messing around with the RAM speeds to try and get them to match, because it's not representative of a real world situation. But let's get into it and see what we can expect in terms of a difference. Now as we make our way through these results, you may be tempted to think negatively of the FX 8350 because in comparison it does fall short, admittedly, but to be honest, I think the FX 8350 is still an okay chip even in 2020 if you pair it with a decent enough graphics card and 16 gigs of RAM. Of course, these factors will depend on how the chip performs for you, but I think that it is still an okay CPU. The main problem I have isn't the performance of this chip at all. The problem I have is the price of this chip on the second-hand market. The same goes for the 8370 and the 9590. They are simply overpriced and sometimes can be very hard to find. This is why a modern Ryzen makes more sense, because not only does it outperform the older FX range, but you will have trouble finding them, the old FX range that is, for a lower price. At least here in the UK, I mean, the 3100 can be purchased for the same price that a lot of these FX 8350s can be found for. So, you know, not only have AMD created some decent competition for Intel, but they've also wiped their own older CPUs off the face of the earth. To be honest, they've made their own stuff obsolete in some way, but you know, if the pricing was right, it all depends on the second-hand market, what's going on price-wise there. If the pricing was right there, then these would still be far easier to recommend, or if you know somewhere where you can find these for cheap, maybe on AliExpress, then they still might be worth considering, but also factor in the cost of, say, an AM3 Plus motherboard. As we start with Call of Duty Warzone, you'll see that with the FX 8350, we were seeing 87 frames per second on average, which again is very respectable, and the 1% low of 54 also isn't bad either. With the Ryzen 3 3100, we were seeing over 100 FPS with a 1% low of 87. This 1% low matches the average FPS that the FX 8350 produced. Now again, both chips performed quite well in Far Cry 5. The FX 8350 did a respectable job of running the game at 1080p with the high preset. It couldn't quite hit 60 on average according to the in-game FPS benchmark, but the 1% low was pretty solid. We did certainly see a few dips here and there, especially when it came to actual gameplay. And once again, you can see the 3100 pulling ahead quite a bit as we ran the same in-game benchmark 3 times and then combined the average figures. Now in Fortnite with the high preset, the FX 8350 actually averaged over 100 FPS, though again, just like in Far Cry 5, we saw a 1% low of 54. There were also a few stutters here and there, but they mainly occurred at the start of each game when we jumped out the battle bus, things like that. But after that, things seemed to smooth out pretty nicely. With the AMD Ryzen 3100, we were seeing 150 FPS plus on average with a much higher 1% low. That's another area where you're going to notice a primary difference. If you're playing on a 60Hz display, for example, you're targeting 60 frames per second, or you've locked the frame rate to 60 frames per second, then both of these chips should be capable of that in a lot of scenarios, but the difference will be more noticeable in the percentile figures. You will experience more drops on the FX chip, and that is what can be off-putting. Now, it's an older one now, but it's an absolute classic. GTA 5 had no problem running at very high settings. I should also mention, if I haven't done so already, that we are using the RTX 2070 in combination with the CPUs, as I have been doing for the past few videos or so. In GTA 5, the FX 8350 achieved a score of 76 frames per second with a 1% low of 63. This was a pretty good result as far as I'm concerned, though with the Ryzen 3100 we were seeing over 100 FPS with a 1% low of 86. Again, I would consider both of these results playable. It's just, I bring it up again, the price of the FX 8350 is too high. For a chip that costs pretty much the same on the used market as a 3100 does new, well, you're losing almost half of the performance in some scenarios, to be honest. Not many, but some. Now, Red Dead Redemption 2 is a little bit closer in terms of the results. This relies more on a GPU, in my experience, a decent GPU. It runs on quite a wide range of processors rather smoothly. The FX 8350 and Ryzen 3100 both handled the game fairly well. On the FX, we saw an average of 60 frames per second, which is always nice, with a 1% low of 42. And on the 3100, we saw 86 frames per second with a 1% low of 57. So again, there were a few drops here and there, but these weren't as significant as they were with the FX chip. Finally, we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Once again, I ran the in-game benchmark test, and the FX 8350 struggled quite a bit here. There were a few stutters that I certainly noticed. You can see that the 1% low is 38, and there will be times when you see the frame rate drop heavily on screen. For the most part, it's an okay experience, but these performance problems were ironed out when using the newer Ryzen 3 3100 processor. I said it in the other video, but this is just for a bit of fun. I was just interested in seeing how these two chips compare. The FX 8350 has been out almost 8 years now, and it's something that still remains pretty popular. I know a lot of people who bought one back in 2012, 2013, and have still continued to use it to this day. It certainly has held up over the last almost a decade, so that is very impressive in its own right. I can't say for sure how much longer it's going to last, but it still seems to be doing an okay job. It's just that you'll certainly notice some hitching and stutters here and there when it comes to more modern titles. We should finalise on the Cinebench R20 result, because this will give you an idea of how this chip will do in CPU intensive tasks. As you can see from the Cinebench R20 result here, the Ryzen 3 3100 pretty much blew this thing not only out of the water but out of the universe, and running this single threaded test on the FX was quite a painful experience, but if you want to get some video editing done, well, it will still do a pretty decent job. It just won't be as snappy, to say the least. That's all I can really say. I hope you've enjoyed this comparison between the older FX chip and the Ryzen 3 3100. As I said before, this was just a bit of fun, but in all seriousness, I can't recommend buying the 8350 in 2020, especially with the 3100 on the market. and the Ryzen 3 1200AF variant. Maybe that should have been the one that I tested here because it is about half the price of a used FX 8350, but maybe that's a video for another day. Thank you very much for watching this one. If you enjoyed it, leave a like down below. If you didn't, leave a dislike. Let me know what you think about the results in the comments below. Let me know if you're still rocking an FX chip in your system and how well it's doing for you. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.